Imagine stepping into New York City in the year 1905. The streets thunder with trolley cars and horse-drawn wagons. The air is thick with smoke from coal stoves and factories. The skyline is beginning to rise, brick by brick, as steel skeletons of early skyscrapers stretch into the clouds. Amid this chaos of growth and change, perched on a hill in Morningside Heights, stood one of the most prestigious universities in America, Columbia. To be a student at Columbia in the early 1900s was to live at the intersection of tradition and modernity, of privilege and pressure, of scholarship and the unrelenting energy of New York itself. It was an experience unlike any other, shaped by the weight of history and the promise of the future. Today, we're going to walk those marble steps, peek into those lecture halls, and feel what it truly meant to be a Columbia student more than a century ago. By the turn of the century, Columbia University had just recently moved to its new campus in Morningside Heights. For most of its life, Columbia had been downtown, in cramped quarters near Madison Avenue. But in 1897, the school unveiled its grand new campus, designed by Charles Follen McKim of the famous firm McKim, Mead & White. The centerpiece was Low Memorial Library, a colossal domed building inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. Its granite steps swept upward, wide and commanding, and at the top, the bronze doors opened to reveal vast reading rooms with marble. For a student in 1900, walking into Low Library was like stepping into a temple of knowledge, intimidating, awe-inspiring, and exhilarating all at once. Surrounding Low were symmetrical red brick academic buildings: Havemeyer Hall for chemistry, Schermerhorn for science, Philosophy Hall, and the School of Mines, which would later become the School of Engineering. Across the lawn stretched the College Walk, then still open to traffic, where horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones between Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway. From the campus steps, students could gaze south and see the city stretching endlessly, or look north toward Harlem, then rapidly changing as waves of immigrants moved uptown. To study at Columbia in those years was to perch on a literal and figurative height, looking out at a city that seemed to reinvent itself daily. Columbia at the dawn of the 20th century was still a university of privilege. Tuition was $150 a year, the equivalent of nearly $5,000 today, which placed it far beyond the reach of most working families. The majority of undergraduates were white, Protestant men from affluent backgrounds. Sons of lawyers, bankers, and merchants filled the classrooms, often wearing starched collars and bowler hats, carrying books bound in leather. Yet Columbia was also beginning to reflect the changing face of New York. Jewish students, barred from many elite schools, found a place at Columbia, though not without prejudice. A small number of black students enrolled, often facing isolation in classrooms and dormitories. Women were not admitted to Columbia College itself, but in 1889 Barnard College had been founded across the street, giving women access to a rigorous education while still keeping them institutionally separate. Columbia and Barnard students often mingled at lectures, clubs, and social events, a quiet but steady step toward co-education. The student body was thus a microcosm of early 20th century America. Tradition dominating, but diversity slowly, inexorably pressing at the gates. So what was it like to actually sit in a Columbia classroom in the early 1900s? Imagine heavy wooden desks, squeaking chairs, and the smell of chalk dust. Professors in frock coats stood at the front, lecturing in booming voices, sometimes for hours without pause. Columbia prided itself on rigor. Freshmen read Homer, Virgil, and Shakespeare. Sophomores grappled with Euclid and Newton. Science students conducted experiments with Bunsen burners and beakers in Havemeyer Hall, which even then was famous for its state-of-the-art labs. Engineering students studied metallurgy and bridge design. No small thing in an era when the city was throwing up iron bridges and steel skyscrapers almost overnight. There was little room for coddling. Examinations were grueling, recitations public. Students were expected to memorize, recite, and defend their ideas under pressure. Late arrivals were frowned upon and excuses rarely accepted. But Columbia was also beginning to experiment. In 1900, the university launched its graduate faculty of political science, philosophy, and pure science, which later evolved into the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Scholars like John Dewey and Franz Boas joined the faculty, pioneering new fields of psychology, anthropology, and education. To sit in their lectures was to glimpse the future of human thought. For most students, however, daily academic life was a demanding grind, relieved only by the thrill of knowing they were at the intellectual heart of New York. Most Columbia students in the early 1900s did not live in dormitories. Housing was limited, so many commuted from family homes in Manhattan or Brooklyn. Those who did board near campus often rented rooms in boarding houses around Morningside Heights, sharing cramped quarters with little heat in the winter and suffocating air in the summer. Meals were simple. A student might grab coffee and a roll for breakfast at a local cafe, eat stew or sandwiches for lunch, and return to a boarding house for dinner. Roast beef potatoes, perhaps a pudding if the landlady was generous. Few had money for luxuries. The wealthiest students dined in clubs downtown, but most lived on modest fare, punctuated by occasional trips to the famous Horn and Hard Art Automat. Campus social life revolved around clubs and fraternities. Literary societies debated current events. The Columbia Spectator, the student newspaper, reported on everything from faculty controversies to football scores. The Varsity Show, begun in 1894, staged comic musicals that poked fun at professors and traditions, a much-needed outlet for student energy. If academics were rigorous, sports were exhilarating. Columbia's football team, dressed in blue and white, battled rivals like Yale and Princeton before crowds of thousands. Games were rough, with little protective equipment, and injuries were common. Yet for students, these matches were moments of pride, binding them together in a common cause. Rowing was another tradition. Crews trained on the Harlem River, their oars slicing in unison as crowds cheered from the banks. Track and baseball also drew enthusiastic support. Athletics provided an identity beyond books, a chance to show that Columbia men could be as strong and spirited as any in the Ivy League. One of the most unique aspects of being a Columbia student in the early 1900s was proximity to New York itself. The city was a laboratory, a theater, a library beyond compare. Students wandered down Broadway to the theaters, where vaudeville acts and early silent films competed for attention. They visited museums like the newly expanded Metropolitan Museum of Art, or heard debates in political halls. The city also offered distractions. Saloons beckoned with cheap beer, gambling dens tempted the reckless, and the red light districts downtown offered forbidden thrills. Columbia students thus lived with one foot on campus, one in the metropolis. For some, it was intoxicating. For others, overwhelming. But it was always formative. It would be a mistake to imagine Columbia in the early 1900s as a purely golden age. Inequities abounded. Jewish students often faced quotas limiting their numbers. Black students, though admitted, were socially isolated and excluded from many clubs. Women at Barnard were sometimes dismissed as second class in the eyes of Columbia men. Class differences were also stark. Wealthy students arrived in carriages or early automobiles, wearing tailored suits. Poorer students scraped by on scholarships, working part-time as tutors or clerks. For them, every textbook was an investment, every semester a struggle to remain enrolled. Yet even within these inequities, Columbia offered opportunities. A working-class immigrant's son could, with effort and talent, rise through the ranks to become a lawyer, a doctor, or a professor. That possibility, however slim, drew many to its gates. Several students who walked Columbia's halls in the early 1900s would later shape American life. Franklin Delano Roosevelt enrolled in Columbia Law School in 1904. though he never completed his degree. Poet and critic Lionel Trilling, anthropologist Margaret Mead, and future Supreme Court Justice Harlan Fiske Stone were all products of Columbia's academic culture. These figures remind us that Columbia was not just a place of study, but a crucible of leadership. To be a student, there was to be aware that the man or woman sitting next to you might one day shape the nation. What did it feel like day to day to be a Columbia student in the early 1900s? Imagine rising early, walking past newsboys shouting headlines about President Roosevelt, past vendors selling apples for a penny, up the marble steps to Low Library. The city hummed below, but on campus, a hush of scholarship reigned. In lecture halls, chalk scraped against blackboards as professors sketched out equations or declaimed lines of Latin. In libraries, students bent over books by gaslight, the smell of ink and leather thick in the air. Outside, football players shouted on the fields, while rowers cut across the river. At night, the city beckoned. Theaters glowing, jazz beginning to bubble in Harlem clubs, political rallies sparking debate. It was an atmosphere electric with ambition. Everyone seemed to sense that the 20th century was a century of change, and that to study at Columbia was to place yourself at the center of it. So what was it like to be a student at Columbia in the early 1900s? It was demanding, exhilarating, inequitable, and unforgettable. It meant enduring grueling exams, but also hearing lectures that pioneered entire fields of thought. It meant sharing classrooms with the privileged elite, but also rubbing shoulders with immigrant sons who would rise to prominence. It meant gazing out over a city that was itself a living textbook. Messy, chaotic, vibrant, and alive. To walk the steps of Low Library in 1905 was to feel both the weight of tradition and the pull of the future. Columbia students carried that tension with them into their lives, shaping a century in which both the university and the city would grow into global icons. If this journey into New York's academic past fascinated you, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Good Old New York for more immersive stories of the city's history.